Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 8th of December. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined by two excellent guests this morning. We have with us Francis Coppola and Murray Pittock. Francis, you're an economist, freelance writer and commentator, and Murray is a historian and professor at Glasgow University. Welcome. Thank you for giving up a sizable chunk of your weekends.
Great to see you, Brian. Good to be here.
Thank you. So, sadly, today is 1019 of the war in Ukraine. The US announced a new $988 million security assistance package for Ukraine on Saturday as Washington races to provide aid to Kyiv before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. In a statement, the Pentagon said the package features drones, ammunition for precision HIMARS rockets, and equipment and spare parts for artillery systems, tanks and armoured vehicles. It follows a £725 million package announced on Monday that included a second tranche of landmines as well as anti-air and anti-armour weapons. European diplomats have warned that Europe military aid to Ukraine will need to be doubled if Donald Trump cuts off US funding. Yesterday, Donald Trump met in Paris with Volodymyr Zelensky, who said any resolution of the war with Russia should be a just settlement that includes strong security guarantees for Ukraine. The meeting was of huge importance to Zelensky, given fears in Kyiv that Trump may urge Ukraine to make concessions to Moscow. Trump had a hastily arranged meeting on Saturday with Zelensky and France's Emmanuel Macron while in the city for the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral. Macron and other European leaders are trying to persuade Trump to maintain support for Ukraine. Zelensky said he had a good and productive meeting with Trump and Macron and that they wanted the war with Russia to end fast and in a just way. US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin warned that failure to continue opposing Russia's actions would have dire consequences. We can continue to stand up to the Kremlin, or we can let Putin have his way and condemn our children and grandchildren to live in a world of chaos and conflict, said Austin, speaking on Saturday at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California. He said this administration has made its choice and so has a bipartisan coalition in Congress. The next administration must make its own choice. Yesterday, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he fully backed anti-government protesters in Georgia after thousands of protesters marched in the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, on Saturday for a 10th day of rallies sparked by a disputed election. Zelensky urged Tbilisi to stop surrendering to Moscow in a meeting with the country's pro-EU president, Salome Zubashvili, in Paris. Forgive my mispronunciation there. Also on Saturday, President Zelensky announced that a second batch of F-16 fighter jets had arrived in Ukraine from Denmark. Zelensky said the second batch of F-16s from Denmark has arrived in Ukraine. This is an example of leadership in defending lives that sets Denmark apart. Russia's defence ministry said on Saturday that its forces had taken Beretsky, a small village close to the embattled town of Kurakov in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. And Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region marked a day of mourning for 10 people killed in a Russian attack on Friday. A further 24 people, including 2 children, were injured when a missile struck a local service station, said Regional Governor Ivan Fedorov. Another 3 people were killed in a strike on the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi on Friday, Ukraine's State Emergency Services said. Francis, it seems to me that not only are these the number of days well over 1,000 now, but our daily updates, they just seem to be getting longer, more and longer. What do you think about the latest one?
There's more going on, isn't there? What 2 years ago was Russia versus Ukraine is now Russia versus Ukraine, Georgia, maybe Romania. That wholly, it's widening out. And stretching Russia more thinly as a result. And I think that is a contributory factor to what we're seeing going on in Syria, because Russia have been supporting the Assad regime, and it's now very apparent that Russia is no longer supporting the Assad regime. And whether that's a strategic decision by Putin to pull out of Syria in order to concentrate resources on his growing number of fronts in his own backyard, is a possibility, I would have thought. But it very much changes the balance of power in the Middle East, and we're also seeing widening out there as well. We obviously saw the escalation of Israel's war beyond Gaza into Lebanon, although there is a ceasefire there. Both sides are violating it, but nonetheless, the official line is that it's holding. But also, what's going to happen now that there's regime change in Syria, and where that's going as well, I think is going to very much change things going forward.
Thank you, Francis.
So the overall, the whole area is like blowing up, really.
Thank you, Francis. Murray, I think that was such a lengthy Ukraine update that time is already against us, but is there anything that you'd briefly like to say?
Well, what I would say is that clearly all parties are taking up positions ahead of the beginning of the Trump presidency, and I would, without going into too much detail further, politely possibly disagree with Francis or take a different view, that I don't think, given the condition of the Black Sea Fleet and the effective threat that Ukraine is being able to pose to the Black Sea Fleet, that Russia will want to lose the Mediterranean coastal bases in Syria, which are now almost the only means of it projecting naval power into the Mediterranean. So I don't think they did anticipate this, and I don't think it was strategic. I think they've just been caught. They've been caught overstretched because of the number of resources that they're pushing into Donetsk and Luhansk and Kursk to try and get Kursk back and to get as much of Luhansk and Donetsk as possible ahead of talks in the next couple of months.
Thank you, Murray. And of course, now we move on to the latest from Gaza and the Middle East. At least 44,664 Palestinians have been killed and 105,976 have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023. And more than 4,047 have been killed and 16,638 wounded in Lebanon. We woke up this morning to a seismic shift in the Middle East, as in less than a week the forces of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham have overthrown the 50-year-old Assad dynasty in Syria and forced the Russian military and diplomats to flee the country. Assad's rule was marked by intense censorship, summary executions, forced disappearances, discrimination against ethnic minorities, and extensive surveillance by the Ba'athist secret police. In 2023, Canada and the Netherlands filed a joint lawsuit at the International Court of Justice accusing the Assad government of infringing the UN Convention Against Torture. Murray, what's your take on this situation? Is anybody going to miss Assad's regime?
Well, nobody's going to miss Assad's regime until the next one arrives, I'm afraid. I don't like to be too cynical, but I fear that this is potentially the situation, that obviously HTS are likely to prevail if Syria hangs together as a single state, and if they do prevail, they will provide an Islamist regime, and doubtless they will say nicer things at the beginning of that regime, as indeed the Taliban did in returning to power in Afghanistan, than will be evident 12 months down the line, because Islamist regimes tend to take similar forms wherever they are, and those forms are never ones that people will find agreeable in the end. I think you have to be realistic about the politics here. Many people in Syria will simply did not get what they want in terms of the Alawite government that they've had, but they're probably not going to get what they want either in terms of the government that's coming down the tracks. Whether that has come simply from domestic insurgency, the transfer of military weapons to the insurgents, or by fronts funded at distance by Israel or elsewhere in order to continue the destabilization of Hezbollah and possibly create also an extended buffer zone in the Golan Heights. You have to remember that when the Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt, they hadn't weakened the army, but now the Syrian army is very much weakened, and so frankly, there isn't much obstacle to the establishment of an Islamist regime in Syria.
Thank you, Murray. Francis, so the question now is, how do you think this is going to affect the prospects for peace and stability in the Middle East?
It's really hard to say. I personally, so the mood music from Syrians today is they're all very happy. Absolutely almost nobody's weeping over Assad. But I think, as Murray was saying, what's coming down the tracks might not be to their liking either. I have to say that tends to be the pattern in the Middle East, that you get rid of one brutal dictator and he's soon replaced by a whole host more. So I actually fear for the future not only of Syria, but also of Lebanon, because the two are very closely tied together. I can't see any prospect of stability or peace or even economic recovery for Lebanon while it's got this Cold War with Israel, which breaks out into a hot war now and then, as we know, and then, and potentially losing what has been quite a stable neighbour and ally for it for some years, might not be quite so stable in future. And there's also the question of how this rebounds to Iran, and which I think is the ultimate goal here, is regime change in Iran. I think this is a step closer towards that. So I think there's going to be more instability to come, sadly, and a lot more loss of life.
Thank you, Francis. Just a wee bit about who the rebels are. It's the terrorist group that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, led by Mohammed Jalani, they were a former branch of Al-Qaeda that since turned against them. Assad's military forces offered negligible resistance, really. The Syrian army claims it withdrew to preserve the lives of civilians. And now there's poorly trained police officers forced into service. They haven't been much use either. Murray, I was thinking, could this be part of the Arab Spring of the early 2010s? Could it be seen that way?
Well, of course, this whole issue kicked off at the civil war against Assad in what was called the Arab Spring. I think, though, once again, when the Arab Spring occurred, there was a lot of positivity about the kinds of political change that those who were protesting wanted to see, and I was then and still am much more skeptical about what that really amounts to. So yes, it's a legacy of the Arab Spring, but it's not likely to be one that promotes pluralism or anything that we would regard as democratic or even benign authoritarianism in Syria, because that's just not what happens. Even if Islamist groups are in a minority, they tend to be absolutely ruthless. They tend to be well armed, and they tend to have a strong degree of cohesion, ideological conformity, and a savage way of dealing with those who step out of line. So they basically operate like a 30s fascist street gang in Germany, and they are very effective in doing that. It's not a matter of popular support or want to see the end of the Assad regime. I'm sure there was very little popular support for Assad, and everyone to see the end of his regime. But it is really the way in which political change happens in the Middle East, as when the autocrat goes. No one wanted the Shah of Iran by 1979. There were protests against him right back to the 60s in West Germany. But look what replaced him. It doesn't necessarily get better, and I don't see any reason to be optimistic this time.
Okay. Francis, President-elect Trump, I think I'm right in saying, has already commented on, put something out on his Truth social media platform. He said Assad is gone, he's fled the country, his protector, Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, was not interested in protecting him any longer. There was no reason for Russia to be there in the first place. They lost all interest in Syria because of Ukraine, where close to 600,000 Russian soldiers lay wounded or dead in a war that should never have started and could go on forever. What do you think of Trump's statement, or America even?
It was interesting as far as it went, but it rather ignores Trump's own agency in this. Indeed, the US's part in this, which we shouldn't ignore. The US still occupies part of eastern Syria. Its troops are there on the ground. So when there's regime change in Syria, whether or not the US is actively involved, it is present. To say the US shouldn't get involved is nonsense. US is there. It's ostensibly there to prevent ISIS re-emerging. But it's just awfully convenient. It happens to be in the part of Syria where there are oil reserves, don't you think? So and also we shouldn't forget that there is already evidence that the rebels do have some backing from Israel, and the US is backing and arming Israel. I don't believe that the US is out of this at all. It might suit President Trump to say it's all because Russia's pulled out, and I have some sympathy for that idea that Russia simply has withdrawn in order to concentrate its resources in Ukraine. I know Murray disagrees with me about that, but
I want to know how it can project naval power when it's got a compromised Black Sea Fleet, no Mediterranean bases, and why naval power has always been a major foreign policy goal of Russia, because it feared being cut off from the sea, particularly in the Med.
Well, that's true. But if I were Putin now, I would be, or I probably would have been already negotiating with rebels to say, look, I'll give you the rest of Syria if you let me keep Tartus.
Yeah, Francis.
Is there any evidence that HTS will let him keep Tartus?
I don't know, but it's bad faith on both sides, isn't it? Do they trust each other? I don't know.
Tartus is the where the Russian naval base is. Is that? Am I right in thinking? Yeah. And again, America does have, and that was under control of Assad's regime, I think, along with another port called Latakia. And the US, the figure I've got is that the US have about 900 troops in Syria, but that doesn't seem like very much to me, considering
they've got a lot of contractors as well. It's not just US troops. They've outsourced a little bit. The figure is much higher than that.
Okay.
Like I said, the objective is their stated objective is to stop ISIS coming back, re-emerging, which is, ISIS re-emerging would complicate this system far more. So it's not something we should want. But it was Trump in a previous incarnation when he was president before. I actually said it was to protect the oil supply.
Murray, I did have a question in mind for you there just now. Oh yeah, nobody's really mentioned Iran yet. Do you think is that going to be an important part of the puzzle?
Well, so I think for the time being, Iran is not in a position to project force in Syria and even proxy force in Syria and Lebanon. It's been seriously weakened. So this is a foreign policy blow to Iran. Iran's calculation was an interesting one, which was by explicitly arming and partially allying themselves with the Russian Federation, they would benefit. This calculation was always possibly rather doubtful, but certainly doesn't seem to have paid off. It's hard to see now that it will pay off in the long term, because even if Putin gets what he wants from, or part of what he wants, and I think it's not really in Trump's interest to give him what he wants, because Trump doesn't want to look like he's losing the deal. He wants to win this deal. So even if Putin gets what he wants, Iran has effectively been weakened by their focus on supporting the Russian Federation in Ukraine because of the military challenges they're facing elsewhere. And it's hard to see that they're going to recover from this very quickly.
Thank you, Murray. Francis, did you want to come in there? Did I maybe miss something that you had said?
I did speak about Iran earlier.
I'm so sorry.
I thought that, given my view that who the forces behind this are, I think the ultimate goal might be regime change in Iran.
Thank you. I might have been looking at my notes rather than paying attention. My apologies. So the next item is right-wing rhetoric versus reality. In America and Europe, political gains have been made by policy-light right-wing rhetoric backed by well-funded and organised social media campaigns. Maybe the best example recently was Keir Georgescu in Romania. Recently, he came from nowhere to win an election outright. The result has since been annulled and the election is going to be rerun after they found strange goings on with cryptocurrency and social media. Francis, I believe you're an expert on cryptocurrency.
I do know a bit
Is
about
that
it, yeah.
right? Yeah. So what's your thoughts on right wing movements at the moment and their policies?
Um, I keep seeing them posting, and I think, worryingly, that despite the evidence of really significant disinformation campaigns, I should point out that the one in Romania was actually backed and funded by Russia. And we have seen previous evidence of Russian interference in American elections and also in the Brexit vote in the UK. Russia has been, shall we say, promoting the nationalist right or supporting the nationalist right in Western countries and even in countries like Georgia now for quite some time. So we did rather sleepwalk into this, but it's very effective what they do. And so now on social media, whenever something like this has, like the Romanian Supreme Court says, no, actually, this election is illegal because of the extent of interference, we need to rerun it. We've now got a social media campaign claiming that this is a coup. This is an attempt to overturn a legitimate election, which it clearly isn't. But that's the kind of messaging we're getting on social media now. And there's a significant number of people who, not knowing much about this and maybe not having the will really to investigate it, just soak it up. Social media is so incredibly dangerous, and it's increasingly in the hands of the right.
Thank you, Francis. Murray, you can probably think of some other examples apart from Georgescu, but what's your thoughts?
Well, there are a multiplicity of factors at play, and some of them the Russian Federation can make play with, and that seems clearly to have happened at scale in the Romanian election. I think one of the interesting things is how limited the European, including the UK, response has been to Russian cyber attacks for years now, and how, of course, in the UK, one of the current, I would say, political poisons we're currently living with is that nobody wants to acknowledge the role that Russian money and influence played in the very narrow 2016 referendum result. Nobody wants to acknowledge it at all, apart from a small and largely social media bound pro-EU groups. The political will is entirely passed on from that because no one likes to think that they're being manipulated by the Russian Federation. But it's better to look it straight in the eye and say that is what they're about. And one of the things that is really indicative of that is the extent to which populist right-wing figures, and remember that Russian troops in Ukraine have been flying the Soviet flag on many occasions there and creating an illusion between themselves and the imperial forces of the USSR. So it's by no wing politician in that sense. One of the interesting things that European right-wing politicians tend to be Putin. And frankly, if you see a right-wing politician who's pro-Putin, you want to, and I'm not going to be too Marxist here, but the Marxist argument that superstructure always responds to base is a very important one. The manifestations of political culture reflect the funding of that culture, and anybody who's pro-Putin, who wouldn't necessarily be, there's no reason why Le Pen in France should appear pro-Putin, given French politics, but why is that? Almost certainly because there is covert or overt support from the Russian Federation for that government. I think Trump's an interesting case because he's much more complicated than people think the US and sometimes the US. If you look at the reasons people voted for Trump, immigration, inflation, and not to put too fine a point in it, the culture wars and woke values are the top three indicators of support for Trump in the US. So actually, I think the trouble is the Democrat Washington consensus cuts across an awful lot of American values in Midwestern society, which is probably never going to vote for them anyway. And also the Rainbow Coalition, like all Rainbow Coalitions, will don't vote according to their institutional identitarian affiliations, individual agency as well as collective identity. So I think those things, Trump is more complicated, but in other cases, pro-Putin right-wing parties are almost certainly responding to Russian influence of one form or another within their organizations and election campaigns.
Thank you, Murray. You were breaking up a wee bit there, but we got
I'll just see if I get a slightly better signal. Yeah.
Maybe it's the Russians are trying to stifle debate.
I'm not going to use Starlink. I know that.
Okay. Murray, you mentioned Le Pen, and I was intrigued by what happened in France last week on Wednesday. Michel Barnier was ousted as the Prime Minister. Macron made a statement afterwards saying that it was because the extreme left and the extreme right had combined to pass a vote of no confidence. And this is kind of relevant to what we were talking about. And he said that both the extreme left and the extreme right were only thinking about themselves and not the voters. And we were kind of trying to talk about policy. But it kind of reminded me of an adage, which I seem to remember, that if politics is a spectrum, then fascism and communism will be at the opposite extremes. But if you turn that into a circle, then they stand cheek by jowl. Is there any, Francis, do you think, is there any truth in that? And is that what happened in France? Did they actually come together and work together to get Barnier out?
I think that increasingly the terms right and left actually don't mean what they used to. So we could be talking about authoritarians and or you can have authoritarians of the left and the right, and you can have nationalists of the left as well as the right. And so it's entirely possible that if somebody wants to get rid of a centrist government, they might go into alliance with another authoritarian nationalist party, even though some of its policies might be ostensibly left-wing ones. It's convenient for nationalist parties to align with each other to get rid of centrist and democratic liberal parties, and that is unfortunately what seems to have happened in France. In Italy, a few years ago, there was an interesting coalition between the far right and the far left, and I seem to recall there was actually a coalition government involving both far right and far left elements for exactly that reason. I don't think it lasted very long.
Thank you, Francis. Murray, what do you think about the circle analogy?
Well, I think the issue is politicians who want to use state control as a means of delivering authoritarian solutions. So yes, there is something in common. The classic definition is that fascism directs the private sector to support the state, and that full-scale socialism, communism, expropriates the private sector to the state. So it's the difference between state confiscation and state direction. But on the spectrum, you're right, those differences sometimes don't amount to very much when you're dealing with an authoritarian political regime, and especially one which is divorced from institutions. For example, if you take Spain in the 1930s, Franco would never have made common cause with any of the Spanish left, but that was because the Catholic Church and the monarchy was central to his authoritarian case. That's not the case in France. It's not the case, or isn't the case in Romania. Where it isn't the case, then really all those traditional historic institutions are of no particular interest, and that also brings right and left closer together, because the right often defends such institutions when they are of importance. When they cease to be of importance, it's about control and power and authoritarianism without reference to the historic institutions of the state.
Thank you, Murray. So now we'll move on to Keir Starmer, who this week he moved on from his 5 missions from the party's general election manifesto, and has produced 6 milestones. And the speech was about, he says he's going to deliver higher living standards by the next election, saying growth must be felt by everyone everywhere. He said his aim was still to make the UK the fastest growing of the G7 economies. He wants to see real household disposable income and the GDP per capita rise in every region of the country, he said, and a challenge. He also talked about a challenge to Whitehall that has grown comfortable in the tepid bath of managing decline, which kind of reminded me of Liz Truss's blob. But the question is, Murray, it's your turn to go first. Is Starmer going to be able to turn this into reality? Quite a confusing speech, I thought.
Indeed. So one of the things that's very interesting about the Office of Budget Responsibility is it was set up to provide independent financial assessment of the impact of government policies. And the OBR fundamentally spent most of the last 5 years telling the Conservatives that what they were doing was damaging the economy. And the OBR have already made clear that the budget set by Rachel Reeves 2 months ago is going to lead to stagnating living standards. So I think, and I realize that we're just examining it here, I think the way in which the post-Alistair Campbell era media create headlines and reportage out of the Prime Minister saying effectively, I believe in motherhood and apple pie and the fairy godmother, is damaging to public discourse in the UK, because all the indicators are that this is not going to happen. He doesn't have any obligation to describe how it's going to happen. And the combination of the newly introduced or being introduced employment rights and the increase in employers' national insurance seems to have created a significant crisis in fragile business confidence and will have a very strong impact on business margins going forward, especially without the reform of business rates. So fundamentally, he's not, on the evidence we've got, going to be able to raise living standards. He's not going to be able to spend money on infrastructure. The issue with infrastructure in the UK is it costs so much more than it does elsewhere in Europe. Why does it cost so much more? The issue is not let's some more infrastructure. The issue is let's stop spending so much on infrastructure, whether it's a special back tunnel on High Speed 2 or something else. Why is it costing a multiple of what it costs in Spain, in France, even in Norway? And house building, nobody thinks that 1.5 million houses can be delivered in England and Wales. The targets which have been sent to councils are almost always refused by the councils. The councils say they can't do it. The land isn't free. It will direct impact on A1 class farming land was the last at the end of this week. I have to say, this is what our media should be focusing on: how these things can be delivered if they're desirable, not once again listening to a prime minister saying things he wants to happen, which he is doing nothing to ensure will happen. I don't mean it's easy. It's not easy. But there's no point in saying I want to see X if your policies militate against X being delivered.
Thank you, Murray. Francis, are these milestones anything to do with the bad start that the current government's had? Or maybe you just want to respond to something Murray said?
Yes, of course they are. I mean, he started off with 5 missions, and now he's trying to make things a bit more concrete, I think. But I think everybody's kind of reacting to it by saying, well, these are either unattainable or it's all a bit meh, isn't it? I mean, Resolution Foundation, he had this idea, Starmer had this idea, was going to increase real household disposable income. Now, this is quite an important measure because it's the amount of money households have left over after they've paid all their essential bills. So we want to see that rising, but actually it does rise nearly always. So saying we want to see real household disposable income rising by the end of this parliament is actually not much of a measure. And the Resolution Foundation rather pissily said any decent government should be able to deliver that, or words to that effect. It all seems either ridiculously unambitious like that, or wildly over-ambitious, like 1.5 million new homes in England, which it hasn't been achieved since the 1950s, when there was a massive social house building programme, and that's what delivered that rate. We have not seen that kind of rate of house building in the private sector since the 1930s that's what we're looking at here. And I'm not at the moment seeing anything really from the government that's likely to make that a reality. So I would like a bit of realism, really, about how exactly you're going to achieve this, and what is it actually going to mean in terms of people's lives. Because having a bunch of targets that are either wildly ambitious or all a bit meh doesn't seem very good, really.
Thank you, Francis. Murray will probably be able to correct me. I think that massive housing boom post-war was called Homes for Heroes. But Oh, Murray, something that one of a column that didn't, or what is it calls them, milestone, a milestone that we didn't see the other day was immigration. Starmer said that immigration isn't a milestone; it's just a basic function of government. Maybe, as Francis was saying, household incomes would be as well. Is that an important omission?
Um, he doesn't expect to be able to deliver what reform or indeed the Tories claim they want, and I'm sure he's left it to one side for the moment. It's not going to go away. It doesn't mean this is a very difficult one, because we have an enormously strong political will throughout Europe to resist immigration, and the countries which are resisting immigration most strongly are nearly always those with the lowest birth rates. So long term, we don't actually have uh, an economic future without significant immigration. The question is what kind of immigration, and governments have been very bad at having that sort of debate. It's either a positive or it's a negative. Sometimes students are a negative, sometimes they're a positive, sometimes agricultural workers are a negative, sometimes they're a positive. So I think there's no consistency around immigration, and I understand why he wants to steer clear of it, but it's not going to go away. I take very much what Francis said about any government should be able to deliver a rise in real income standards. But actually, the OBR's prediction is that there won't be such a rise as a consequence of this budget, that we will end up more or less steady state from where we are in 5 years' time. And this is in a context where real wages are hardly very much higher than they were in 2008. Productivity is a major problem. And further taxes on employment are not going to improve productivity. It's a major UK issue, and it's the only route really to growth. One of the obvious secondary routes to growth, re-entering the European single market, has been ruled out unconditionally by Starmer. So the extraordinary position of a government claiming that its central policy is something that another of its central policies effectively prevents it from achieving.
Thank you, Murray. Francis, just briefly, can you discern any reason why immigration isn't a milestone for Keir Starmer?
I would say because he knows perfectly well that he can't deliver his growth targets without immigration. I mean, every analysis, the analysis that I've done in recent months on where growth comes from for the UK and has done for some time, it's come entirely, and I mean entirely, from immigration, from bringing people in to do additional work. If we stop doing that, then we won't have economic growth, because we haven't at the moment found a way of delivering economic growth through rising productivity among people who are already here. We haven't worked that out. It's been an issue for years, the productivity puzzle. Had loads of people in work, but the productivity was on the floor. It's still there. And so the growth that the Tories managed to achieve was achieved entirely by the highest levels of immigration for really quite some time. And I'm not talking about asylum seekers here, I'm talking about legal immigration. That's how they were delivering growth. If Starmer cuts back on that, where is the growth going to come from? He doesn't appear to have a plan for increased productivity, which is what we actually need.
So, Francis, could I just ask? So, just raise an issue with you there. One of the things that the LSE study in 2016 suggested is that the net tax benefit per EU immigrant into the UK was around £2,000 slightly more at 2016 prices. And we've actually seen a shift from largely EU immigration to largely non-EU immigration in the last 5 years. Is the composition and trend of migration actually militating against migration being as effective in the future at delivering growth as it was before Brexit?
No, absolutely not, because the immigrants who are coming in from places like India, they're skilled immigration. They're skilled immigrants. People got this idea that we're bringing in large numbers of unskilled, low-paid immigrants. No, we're not. They're mostly skilled people who earn quite high salaries, and that's where our growth is coming from. So, if anything, we're going to become even more reliant on immigration than we were.
So, Francis, we're technically out of time on this, but so do you think that the Westminster government will start to move and have policies that are closer to the Holyrood government, Scottish government?
Um, the Hollywood government, I think, bit the bullet on immigration. I mean, said quite strongly for some years now that we need immigration in order to grow. I think that the Westminster has kind of boxed itself into a corner by paying lip service to the anti-immigration. We've got to close the borders. We've got to stop them all coming in, while at the same time acknowledging it's not going to get the growth it wants unless it lets immigrants, unless we have high levels of immigration. I don't know how Starmer is going to square that one, but I would like him actually to be more open and transparent, and if that moved him closer to what the Scottish government has done over some years now, then bring it on, frankly.
Thank you, Francis. Murray, it's good to see you've got the sunshine in where you are. I hope you'll be able to get outside and enjoy it soon. But the next item is the Scottish Government's budget. So after 14 years of UK austerity, the Labour government in London made great play of increasing Scotland's block grant, and the SNP government in Edinburgh has used that money to fund progressive policies in Scotland. And that's to the consternation of Scottish Labour. You'll remember George Fawkes once said the SNP are doing it deliberately, and policies like scrapping the two-child cap have resulted in a jump in support for the SNP and for the independence movement in general. So, Francis, my question to you is, will Labour MSPs vote for the budget? And because at the moment it's only a draft budget, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking at this earlier and thinking, that's quite a conundrum for a Labour MSP, actually, because on the one hand, the budget contains things that cover for the fact that, the milestones from the Westminster government include things that are devolved, so education, health, that kind of thing. And so the increases in health spending and education spending for England and Wales, the Scottish government needs to do something similar, and you know that, and that's what's in the budget, and that's as you would expect. I think there should be more for early years myself, but it's on those lines. But at the same time, the Scottish government has gone and parked its tanks on Keir Starmer's lawn and then said, yeah, and there's the two-child limit and the winter fuel payment, and we're going to do those as well, which is not Westminster government policy, and which Labour MSPs are going to have some difficulty voting for. So on the one hand, they ought to vote for the budget because it complements the targets put forward by the Westminster government. But on the other hand, there are things in there that are going to be quite hard for them to vote for, given that it goes against what the Westminster government is doing. I'm not sure which way they're going to jump, to be honest.
Thank you, Francis. Murray, it kind of struck me that Shona Robeson's been quite canny as a draft budget. It seems to give something to all of the parties to try and get them on board. So there's tax cuts for the Tories, but not for those on higher earnings. There's extra investment in renewables for the Greens, but not free school meals. And abolish the two-child cap for Alba, but again, not free school meals. So if they do give free school meals, then they would get both the Greens and Alba. Or am I being simplistic?
Well, they could. See, this is an electorally really astute budget. It's one of the most astute pieces of politics that the SNP administration, Holyrood, to my mind, have carried out in the last couple of years. So in that sense, it puts Labour as Leslie rightly says, in a really difficult position. I don't expect them to support it in the end, but it's a difficult position for them. And the John Swinney's government will enjoy seeing Anas Sarwar for once being put in a difficult position, because nobody else is going to put him in a difficult position. He gets very, very kid glove handling from nearly all quarters. So that's important. I think that they could make further concessions, because they're going to need the Liberal Democrats at least. Easier to get the Liberal Democrats than the Greens, perhaps, and Alpa. Though Alpa and the Liberal Democrats rather than the Greens. But the question really is also fiscally. Some of the impact of these costs are not calculated, certainly not beyond the 2026 election, and arguably slightly difficult. There'll be some slight difficulties towards the end of 25-26. And if free school meals put into that mix, that would increase the level of risk. So I think they're living in terms of kind of being responsible government. I think they're living on the edge here, but they're living on the edge in order to secure an electoral outcome in 26, which will enable them to take corrective action by being a government, by being the new government once again for an absolutely unprecedented fifth term. And they are looking as if they could do that, because one of the things that the Labour Party has always fallen down on in Scotland is that they simply will not present a Scottish version of themselves. Henry McLeish tried, Jack McConnell tried to a degree, but they simply behave as if they are the representatives of the Westminster government in Scotland. And that has always been the problem with devolved politics for the unionist parties. None of them have actually, as in other administrations, in Catalonia, in the 70s and 80s, in Bavaria, set up a politics which is domestic, not nationalist, but domestically Scottish. So they don't do that. Because they don't do that, they're really vulnerable to the perceived failures of Starmer's government. Interestingly, though, it's not yet coming through in council by-elections and so forth that Labour are turning down in Scotland. Labour are losing votes hand over fist in England and Wales. In Scotland, they're holding up pretty well. And I think that's because the SNP is still suffering from the problems of long incumbency. So the battle's not over yet for the SNP. This is an extremely electorally astute, if fiscally slightly risky, budget.
Thank you, Murray. It's interesting what you were saying there about Labour not being Scottish enough is kind of a theme that Leslie Riverick's been talking about a lot in her podcast lately. And she thinks that Anas Sarwar's recent U-turn on the winter fuel payments is maybe a start of him beginning to acknowledge Scotland is different from the rest of the UK. But Francis, we often hear criticism about the SNP government when they don't do things that are within their power. And I think, tell me if I'm wrong, they could have used tax powers over aviation to reduce emissions, which would have been would have appealed to the Greens. And then there was the Scottish government bonds, which Hamza Yousaf talked about when he was First Minister. Would that be fair criticism? Do you think they should have done either of those measures?
Yeah, I mean, if they want to, over the longer term, to diverge from what Westminster does, then yes. And certainly sort of hastening the progress towards net zero would be good. I've long thought the Scottish government should have more independent borrowing powers anyway. So, yeah, I do think they should have done it.
Okay, but thank you, Francis. There's time yet. Maybe somebody will ask them to do that and they'll agree. And can we move on now maybe to the University of Glasgow has announced new research into Robert Burns' connections with Scottish Freemasonry, which is said to have inspired A Man's a Man for all that. And we covered this on Scotland at 7 the other night, if people are wanting to find more detail about that. I was, forgive me, Murray, I'm going to be asking you first about this, but forgive me if this gets too personal. But I was brought up Catholic, and I remember being explicitly told as a child that Catholics don't like Robert Burns because he was a drinker and a womanizer, and Catholics, of course, weren't allowed to join the Masons. So, is this another reason why Catholics should dislike Robert Burns?
Well, I think the Centre for Robert Burns Studies in the University of Glasgow is not, shall we say, it does not lack Catholics in its population. Um, I am one myself, so I don't think that's necessarily an issue here at all. I think one of the, although I think it represents really very important social uh, and cultural realities of Scotland in the past. So what this has come from is a really good relationship with the Grand Lodge of Scotland, particularly carried out by that well-known non-Freemason Professor Jerry Carruthers, and which has led to a significant funding for research into Burns's links to Freemasonry, and of course with it, strong access to the existing Masonic archives. So the shape of the project, the students being appointed, the shape of the project is not clear yet, but I think the early indications are there's an enormous amount of work to be done on the importance of not only of Burns's Freemasonry, but Burns in Masonic culture in Scotland and indeed in the north of Ireland in the 19th century. So this is an exciting development, one of the new directions in which work on Robert Burns is going, and it's a sign of the confidence the Centre for Robert Burns Studies as Queen's Anniversary Prize winners enjoys, that it's been funded by the Grand Lodge of Scotland.
Thank you, Murray. And just for the record, I didn't go along with that when I was told that as a child. I love Burns and things like good Burns supper and a fond kiss. Francis, is this something that you've spent much time thinking about?
Oh, not a great deal. I mean, my parents-in-law actually were third generation Italian immigrants in Scotland, so Catholic to the core, and they were also devoted members of the Burns Club in Dollar. Great fans of Robert Burns. So I'm not. Maybe they didn't know about his Freemason links. I don't know. But clearly, a lot of Catholics are fans of Robert Burns. I think anything that sheds more light upon an important literary figure like this, one who's very important in Scotland, is just helps us to understand the man and his work even better. It would be equivalent to where I live in Rochester, which is very Dickensian, finding out more about Charles Dickens. And we would go, yeah, we want to know more about him. We want to understand his work better. We want to understand the man better. And I think that's a good thing for everybody.
Thank you, Francis. And it's we're being told Catholics can now become Masons, but that wasn't always the case, was it, Murray? Is it always the case? Yeah.
What? The 1736 papal prohibition has been overturned?
Oh, okay. I don't. I don't pretend. I don't pretend to be very knowledgeable about it. Honestly, I don't pay any interest to masonry at all. But sorry, carry on, Murray.
It's all right. I think there are Catholics that are Freemasons, and there always have been. Although but I do think the prohibition is still in force. Interestingly, in Burns's own lifetime, one of the ways in which the United Irishmen cooperated with the Catholic defenders in 1798, and the 1798 Rising was through their with the membership that both of them enjoyed in some of the lodges in the north of Ireland. So whether or not that comes through in the research or not, I don't know. But there's the story of Freemasonry is a little bit more complicated. And I'm sure that's what as Les is indicating, a little bit more complicated than people sometimes think. And it's not a matter of simple stereotypes. One of the things that, for example, when Burns statues were unveiled in the 19th century, is quite often they brought people together. They were a means of bringing actually what was then a very disrupted, literally, but also segmented and sectarian Presbyterian political culture together. And Freemasonry was an important umbrella organization for bringing together United Presbyterians, Free Presbyterians, Reformed Presbyterians, Kirk of Scotland Presbyterians, and the various other branches and factions that existed into single civic celebrations of major figures, of whom Burns was very central. So in that sense, Freemasonry acted as a kind of umbrella organisation to Scottish civic society in the 19th century.
That's interesting because there are statues to Burns all over the world. I know there's one in Boston, there's one in New York. And I've always thought that they were there simply because Americans appreciated his work. But so is it more likely that they're there because of Masons in America with Scottish connections?
Not so clear. It's so in some cases, no doubt, not so clear that it is that Freemasonry is so dominant in the US. What I would say though is that Burns was not only was Burns uh, with Shakespeare, Lincoln's favorite poet, and Lincoln was extremely keen on Burns. And rather, although he was assassinated before he and his wife could make the pilgrimage to Scotland, his wife went on a Burns pilgrimage in the late 1860s. She was actually there at the same time as Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, was also on a Burns tour of Scotland, because Burns and Burns songs have been used in US elections since the late 1820s. So he was embedded in American political culture, and his celebration is part of that culture, because Burns is a proof for Americans that there is still in Europe American people with that dislike of tyranny, that dislike of authority, the desire for the man of independent mind, which is the foundational value of the United States Constitution at its best. They saw in Burns someone who was that, but remained European. And so that was one of the reasons for his huge popularity in the States, a popularity which to some extent endures.
Thank you, Murray. Francis, I'm conscious that this item's kind of Murray-centric, uh, but is there anything that you want to say in the last couple of minutes? But I do have a question about a man's a man for all that, Murray. It's now being linked to Freemasonry, his Freemasonry. Usually it's used as an example of when he was thinking about taking up a job linked to slavery in America.
So yeah, actually, Bands a Man for All That became the anthem of the abolitionist movement, and but it's probably related. It is related to Freemasonry, no doubt, but it's also related to the "Am I Not a Man and a Brother" medallion, which Josiah Wedgwood produced in the 1780s as part of the abolitionist cause, which was distributed widely in Dumfries and the county, Dumfriesshire, in the Dixon anti-slavery sequence of rallies and speeches in 1792. Burns almost certainly got hold of the medal there, and its language and concept translates into the 1795 Man's a Man.
Francis, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
I'm not sure how I can follow that, really. Thank you, Maria. It's been really, really interesting. And I think this whole project is really interesting. It's always really interesting to find out more about people in their time and how their ideas evolved and how that goes into their work. That's terrific. Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating, thank you. So that is the end of the show. So before we go, we just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on your generosity. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach £36,000 by the end of the year. It's now December, and we've raised over 18,500. However, to pay our bills and to survive, we need to raise that £12,000 to get us back on target. We face costs of over £4,000 a month, but receive donations of around 2,500, which we appreciate. But we urgently need more regular subscribers, and we need to clear our debts as well. We're at a crisis point, and we really need your donations right now to be able to pay our bills and survive. You know that these programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, or please donate whatever you can afford. Meanwhile, I thank you to you, Francis, and thank you to you, Murray, for both of your contributions and for giving up so much of your weekend. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Very enjoyable.
Okay, thank you. So that's goodbye from us here in the studio, and we'll see you next week during Scotland at 7. Thank you. Goodbye.